Hi, I'm Amit Bouri with the Global Impact Investing Network, and I wanted to welcome you all to this important conversation that I'm thrilled to have with Joanne Kellermann, who's the chair of the board for PFZW, a major pension fund in the Netherlands, one of the largest pension funds in Europe, and one of the largest pension funds in the world. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Joanne over the years, through her work, and thinking about how to, translate their portfolio to have a deeper focus on impact. And as we open up this conversation, I want to start with a big question as we welcome Joanne, which is, Joanne, if you could just talk about your views on the responsibility of institutional investors and their role in shaping a sustainable future.
That's quite a question, Amit, and great to be here. Thank you. When we think of pensions, we think of, pensions with purpose. So we think about the two things you can do when you're a pension investor. First and foremost, of course, you dare to provide good pensions for people in the future far ahead. But secondly, there's things you can do with that money in the meantime. And things you must do in the meantime. And that means that what we try to do is we invest in what we know. We identify the risks, also the not yet financial risks there on the horizon. And then an increasing share of our portfolio is aligned with the Paris Accord and with ESG goals. So that's the big goal that we're trying to do. We started doing that actually 5 years ago by developing a joint strategy together with our asset manager and fiduciary manager, PGGM. So we have a joint strategy now that is, of course, in some details different, but in the big lines, it's the same. And it's on the one hand providing good pensions, and it's on the other hand providing with our investments real world impact and a return that is still better than average. The way we try and do that is, we try to know what we own, to signal to the markets that we think it's important, that also non-financial risks and non-financial outcomes matter. And then what we try to do is to basically try and meet those twofold goals, or to increase the overlap on the one hand between what we need financially and on the other hand what we need socially, or more general in the world. Knowing what we own is an important element of what we do, and that's also an important element of the changes we've recently been making to our investment strategy. And that has a lot to do with our participants and our stakeholders. We see more and more that our participants really want an explanation of why we invest in the companies or in the assets we do invest in, what it means, what those companies are doing, what's in it for them, for the participants. And that also means that we've sort of shifted our focus from a very broad and very passive equities portfolio towards what we're currently building, a much more focused and targeted portfolio, simply because we want to be able to make those conscious decisions, and we want to be able to explain those decisions to our participants.
Well, I think one of the things that's been so impressive to me is just how you've kind of evolved your thinking, all in service of those pensioners, you have the members and participants as you speak about them, workers who are counting on you to provide for their retirement and to provide for their future. One of the things that I've really appreciated is that, PFZW and your work with PGM, you've evolved over the years in your thinking on sustainability and impact. You've been thinking about, how do you think about, like, as you mentioned, the kind of passive strategies, to how do you think about, applying a lens across the portfolio. And increasingly, when we've been connected with one another, and you've been working more closely with the GIIN, it's largely been as you're evolving to thinking about how you can deliver kind of positive real world outcomes for the pensioners. How do you actually help improve health and agriculture and food and progress that you can measure towards addressing climate change? Now, along that journey, there must have been so many major decisions to figure out how do you evolve kind of those key steps. And I thought it might be interesting if you could just unpack one of those pivotal moments, one of those decisions where you had to think about how do you advance your action and the actual behavior and strategy of how you're thinking to continue to stay aligned with those interests of your members and participants.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there've been a few. I can tell you that. It's been it's been an interesting 5 years, the past 5 years. And of course, we monitor very closely what our participants, what they think, what they feel, what their opinions are. And in our case, it's important to bear in mind that we provide pensions for the healthcare and welfare workers in the Netherlands, some 3 million, and 85% of those are women. And when you question them, they have particular issues that really concern them a lot. For instance, recently our survey showed that many of our participants are very worried about the gambling industry. Online gambling became legal a few years ago in the Netherlands, and it has sort of ballooned, and with that also the number of people who are addicted. So recently we've decided to altogether remove the gambling industry from our portfolio. That is a clear example. But I think another pivotal moment, and that was more something that played a role in our board. It's now more than 3 years ago, I think, when there was a new IPCC report. The climate committee came out with their big report, which was extremely alarming. And in the report, they gave a very stark warning about climate change and also about the dangers of the current path we are following as a world in terms of using and producing fossil fuels. And I remember very distinctly that we had a 2-day meeting with the board about all kinds of other subjects. And suddenly somebody said, guys, we need to discuss this. We cannot do our day-to-day business. We need to discuss this report and what it means for us. So we sat down and we discussed. And then 2 weeks later, we had a prepared discussion about what to do, whether to divest our fossil fuel investments altogether or whether to take another course. And of course, the debate was, if you divest, you can't influence anything anymore. You're no longer a shareholder. You're no longer at the table. So what we decided to do was to find a middle way that we called smart engagement, in that we sent a letter to all the companies we invested in who are fossil fuel producing companies, saying in 2 years' time, we want to make sure that all our investee companies are Paris aligned and have credible plans on the path to meet the Paris goals. And we will survey you every 6 months to see if you're on track with reaching that goal within the next 2 years. And we did. We also announced that we would be doing that. We published it, and we published every 6 months the number of companies we invested in and the number we had divested from. And I think it was a mixed experience that we had. It felt good to be able to do something and to take a decision. But in terms of real world outcomes, we were not so successful because we hardly have any investments in this industry anymore. All the big companies simply showed that they were not committed to meet those Paris goals. That was, of course, in terms of outcome, disappointing. So we've also been experimenting. We haven't found a silver bullet yet, but that's another reason why we felt, guys, we have to do this differently. We really have to take another route and make sure that we invest in the companies that we believe in for our own reasons.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, thank you for sharing that. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about it is that, there was a strategy that was very methodical, but also your candor about what worked and what didn't work, I think is really important because all of our members and everyone who watches the show, we're all trying to figure out better ways of achieving impact in the world. And that story really illustrates, I think the way you think about this, but also all, with your core sense of purpose, which is to care for the future of all of your members. And I think one thing that's really kind of powerful about that is given the composition of them as healthcare and welfare workers, these are the people who take care of society. And I think there's something, really special about the way you're thinking about caring for those who care for the rest of us. And I really appreciate that sense of responsibility you carry.
Yeah. Could I just add one more thing? Because one of the things I think this story shows is that although we were a very big investor, we weren't big enough. We didn't have enough influence. And that also shows how powerful and how important it is to cooperate. And, that's why, the GIIN is a fantastic platform to foster that cooperation. So I really want to stress that we need those alliances because nobody can do this alone.
No, thank you for that. And I think one of the things that I also hear, and how you talk about this is something that I think is really core to how we try to operate as the GIIN, and is this combination of big ambitions for investing in a better world and creating a better future for everyone, but also humility about how hard that actually is and how we need, we're better together and how we need a network and community of people who can, we can push our thinking, we can learn faster, and hopefully we can drive towards better outcomes as a community. So thank you for that. Now, speaking of our engagement and our own relationship with PFZW and PGGM, one of the ways we actually started to get more involved together was a big step that you took that I've been incredibly impressed by, which is the work that you've done in collaboration with PGGM to adopt a plan that would look at impact, across your entire portfolio. And using this investment policy 2030 to look at risk, return, and impact across a very big and very massive global portfolio. And one of the things, of course, that has implications for, on the investment management side that PGM does on your behalf is it has implications for strategy, for portfolio construction, for how you even think about like staffing and resourcing it. But, elevating up to your level. As a trustee and as a chair of the board, you would love to hear you hear you talk about how you think about this outcomes focus, about how you can actually set a strategy focused on real world change, or in kind of more plain speak, how do you think about a strategy that delivers better healthcare, a better quality of life for people, a better and safer kind of environment, and how you've been able to think about that as a really incredible transition, which is still underway, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're still in the midst of it, and indeed, it has a huge impact at an organizational and a people and a talent level, and at all levels actually. But yes, well, what we're trying to do is to really integrate in our strategy the financial return, the risks that are financial and also the not yet financial risks, and finally impact and sustainability. And I think it may sound it may sound revolutionary, but it really isn't in our minds because we have a very young population of members, and we are investing for the next 100 years. So we are a long-term investor, and so of course we have a vested interest in the long-term future. In a way, it totally makes sense to integrate these three elements and make them equally important in our investment decisions. Of course, another thing is how do you get from conceptualizing that into actually implementing that. And one of the things we do is to also to try and make it a bit more concrete. Also for our members is that we have reserved part of our portfolio dedicated to investments in healthcare, and in particular in healthcare innovations, where we try to make the work of our participants, the people working in healthcare, more efficient, lighter, perhaps more lightening the burden, because well, as I think everywhere in the Netherlands, we have huge shortages in staff, in hospital staff, for instance, in care staff. So anything that helps to lighten the burden helps, and it also helps to limit the cost for our employers, in terms of sick leave and disability, as a consequence of the sometimes very difficult work that our workers are doing. As an example, we've recently invested in a startup company that has invented this device that you can put in the beds of patients, and can thereby monitor whether they're asleep or not. This is something that when you hear about it, you think, why wasn't this invented before? It's so totally makes sense. But what it means is that the night nurse can just monitor whether everybody's comfortable and is asleep. Mm-hmm. But also in the mornings, it means they don't have to wake, to open the door, put their heads inside and see if patients are awake. They know if patients are awake or not, and whether they need help or anything. And so that's the type of investment that's really literally close to home, and can make a real world impact, and hopefully also has a good financial return. So we're trying to both conceptually, but also, on the ground in a visible way for our participants, be there and show them that what we're doing with their money is not just financial return to provide their pensions, but also, making sure that we make their workplace a bit better to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's such a great example and such a great way of thinking about it. And it all comes back, of course, to your duty to your members. But I think what I really appreciate about that example is around improving people's lives, both the lives of the patients and creating better health outcomes, but also the lives of the workers and making sure that they are less prone to burnout and other things that, certainly we see, happening to hardworking healthcare workers around the world. With that specific example, too, you may have an additional market, because I imagine a lot of parents and grandparents would love to know if their kids are sleeping. I think it may a bigger financial return than you realize. But I think that's another kind of societal benefit that can emerge from this particular company and product. One of the things that I think is also so interesting that we spend a lot of time thinking about at the GIIN is how do we understand and measure impact? How do we know if we're doing a good job at achieving impact outcomes? We do a lot of work on very technical ways, and things like Iris Plus, which we're thrilled just got kind of the support of the United Nations as part of their Financing for Development initiative. But we also try to help people at strategic levels think about what this all adds up to. How do you understand if something's performing, when it comes to impact? The majority of our work is really focused on investors and the practitioners, the people doing the deals, the people managing the portfolios. To the extent that you can talk about this from your kind of bird's eye view, as someone who is like a steward of these assets on behalf of the and not managing the assets themselves, but actually making sure they get managed properly and in support of your pensioners' interests. Would love to hear how you think about what you want to know about the impact performance, and how impact measurement can support you in thinking about if you're achieving your goals as a trustee.
I have to say, Amit, that this is a difficult topic, and we know how hard it is, to get it right. And I think what the approach we've taken as a board is that we said we would like to keep it simple, and let's make a start. Try to stay close to home and close to our beliefs. And rather than getting it right to the last digit, let's start off and start measuring and see where we get, and if we get it wrong, then start again. And I think it's really something everybody's struggling with, and what we feel is that we better start with trial and error than finding the best solution that gives us outcomes that look exact but are not exact. So all in all, there's no real good answer or strategy for us here. What we've told the people at PGGM is, try and see what works and come back to us, and then we'll see if we like it, and if it doesn't work, we'll try something else, because it's still a very difficult area. On the other hand, as you know, we are subject to the CSRD in the Netherlands, and so we're also subject to a lot of regulation. And there also, of course, we're preparing for that regulation to come into force next year. So there's a lot that we have to measure, that we have to report. And again, there, what we try and do is make it as clear as possible and as understandable as possible, because ultimately this is something we want to use to communicate to our participants. And rather than making it overly exact and complicated, we should try and find a way to communicate it. And as it is, we already have so many things that are, kind of challenging to communicate. So anything that makes it easier is welcome.
Yeah. Well, that certainly resonates with us, and I think one of the ways that we've seen our work and our work with our members, like PGGM, is really to help create kind of some common like standards and like processes, because that allows everyone to be kind of speaking the same language and using the same kind of techniques. And we certainly see a lot of movement and regulation, and of course everyone has to comply with those, and that'll kind of create a baseline. But what we really see, increasingly a focus for executives and trustees is, the ability to like get information that helps them do two things. One is to understand if they're meeting their goals, and also, inherent in that is what you're explaining, like how do we need to evolve and adapt? Are we getting the information we need to make sure we're on track? And if not, how do we actually change our approach? And then the second piece, is that we're actually spending a lot more time on as well at the GIIN, is on how do we actually communicate this to important stakeholders? Because I think one of the things that we're seeing, just happening, across societies, is people want to see real results. I think people are concerned about what's happening in the world. They're concerned what's happening in their communities. And I think investors like you can really have a powerful story to say about how you're actually investing in a better world. And I think that's what's so critical, that I think we're hoping we can help play a role at the GIIN in creating better tools and methodologies and frameworks for how to communicate to stakeholders, because I think impact investors have a lot of good things to say. I think the focus on measurable outcomes really equips impact investors to have wonderful kind of stories and messages and cases to make to society. But getting the framing right is really tricky, because it's not just a technical element. It's something you have to explain in a relatable way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground. I've really appreciated this conversation. But as we bring this to a close, I want to zoom out to kind of two questions I would love to get your perspective on. One is that, just something that you spoke about earlier in the conversation is just how you're thinking about this work in the context of a rapidly changing world. You talked about the IPCC report being very influential in your strategy. We, of course, see continued really important attention on how we need to do more to address the climate crisis. We're also seeing a lot more conversation around how do we actually address inequality, and how we actually create a more sustainable society in addition to a more sustainable planet. I would love to hear just any perspective you can offer on how the role of a large asset owner like PFZW can really evolve to help play a positive and constructive role in addressing these big systemic issues, recognizing that even as one institution, you can't change everything.
I think this is a challenge we're all facing, Amit. Currently, governments are not really geared towards long-termism, and a lot of the huge problems we're facing in the world are currently not being addressed. And of course, as asset owner, as a single asset owner, you cannot take on all the problems of the world. But at the same time, it is, like I said, it's part of our duty. If your duty is to invest for the long term, for the next 100 years, our duty clearly also includes making sure that where we can, we do address these problems and at least not make them worse. So we really see it as part of our mission to stay the course. And we are not so concerned with how we call it or what words to use or how we brand it. But when we ask our participants questions about, what they think important, what we do with their money, we don't see a big difference over the last few years. They still think it's important that we look at the long term, that we take care of people, that we take care of clean water, that we take care of the earth, that we make sure that there is good health care for people, and that we make sure that people have decent wages and decent working conditions. So these are things that are to do with, common decency, good housekeeping, and managing long-term risks. So in that sense, not much has changed.
Mm. No, and I really appreciate that perspective. And we're actually seeing, an increasing number of institutional investors starting to think along these lines. This fundamental thing that you point out around if we're trying to deliver sustainable financial returns in the long term, obligations 30, 40, 50 years down the line, where people are counting on you for their retirement. To deliver sustainable financial returns for the long term, of course, you need a sustainable economy, which means you need a sustainable society and a sustainable planet. And so increasingly we see this recognition that to meet the core purpose of pension funds and insurance companies and their fiduciary duty, it's becoming increasingly prioritized, that they need to also think about how to have a positive impact to shape the future economy to make sure they can meet those obligations. Yeah. And you've been so open about the way you're thinking about this and also the things that you're still working through, which is something that I really appreciate. And I think it'll be so important to our listeners. At the same time, one of the reasons why I wanted to get your perspective is that you are playing a leadership role in the market. You're kind of pushing the frontier and then you're doing it again as you've kind of evolved your thinking. And we do a lot of work at the GIIN with asset owners all over the world. Certainly, others in Europe, but those we see in the US and Canada and places like Japan, Singapore, Australia, and beyond. And what I'd love to hear is any advice you can offer them. And I realize it's a work in progress, but you've also come a long way. What advice would you give to other, institutional investors, other asset owners who are earlier in their journey about how they can hopefully learn from your experience and move along faster on their path towards investing in a better and sustainable future?
I don't know if I'm in a position to advise anybody, but what I can tell you from our experience is that it's important to keep that connection with the participants and to keep explaining what you're doing, to keep being able to explain your decisions. And personally, I think that for that reason, this know what you own principle is a very important one. People, we don't no longer get away with, oh, we're surprised. Oh, is this in our portfolio? Oh, we weren't aware. That is no longer good enough. People are starting to hold us accountable. They want to know, they're interested, they're engaged, and they expect us to be engaged too. And I think in that sense, it works both ways. We welcome the fact that our participants are getting more engaged and more interested in pensions. It's been different, and at the same time, we need to be prepared for that and communicate and feel supported in what we're doing. So it's a two-way street.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. And I really appreciate that, focus on knowing what you own, which I think really speaks to just having like the consciousness and awareness of what's in your portfolio and what are the implications and impacts of those companies and those assets. And then connecting that, of course, to your stakeholders, the pensioners and beneficiaries. And how do we actually make sure they understand what you're doing and what the path is and the strategy. And I think that kind of perspective, both the technical side and also the connecting and communication piece, is something that we're seeing as being really critical to being successful on this journey. Well, I'm so grateful for this time. We've had you speak at our Impact Forum, and it was wonderful to have you there. And I think, having a time to have a more in-depth conversation here on Impact Now is something I'm incredibly grateful for. I just want to thank you for joining us and thank you for your involvement, both for your leadership in the world, but also for your leadership within the Global Impact Investing Networks community. So thank you for your perspective today.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Amit.